whenever I look at labs, the first thing I do is I'm going to look at the CBC with a differential. So essentially that's your red blood cells, that's going to be your white blood cells. I'm looking at everything with your red blood cells, the average size of the red blood cells, the hemoglobin, the weight of the hemoglobin, the density of the hemoglobin, the percentage of your blood that is actually red blood cells, hematocrit. I'm going to be looking at all of these different things. So they tell me a ton about oxygen delivery. Oxygen delivery tells us a ton about your capacity for being aerobic. So for example, if you have low red blood cell count, or let's say you have a normal red blood cell count, but your hemoglobin is actually really low and your hematocrit is low, we're showing signs of maybe some forms of other types of anemia, not just like a red blood cell anemia, but like maybe a pernicious anemia, we might start seeing some issues with oxygen delivery. And so what I mean by this is I just don't give two fucks. If you run 27 miles a week, like you're going to struggle to be aerobic because you just cannot deliver oxygen. So I always look at the red blood cell stuff first. And then I also look at white blood cells. And the main reason for that is I don't care how much you train, how much you sleep. If you have a system that doesn't have a good immune system, I should say, you're going to basically tank and you're not going to recover from your training. So I always look at those things first. Then I start looking at the CMP, which is, looking at your electrolytes, looking at your glucose levels. I also look at A1Cs, which is not classically a part of a CMP, but I always look at them at the same. We'll look at liver enzymes. We look at your kidney function. We look at your gallbladder. I also look at a lipid panel. And then I like to get a little deeper with stuff too. And I like to look at things like thyroid, and I like to look at vitamin D and certain minerals like magnesium. So I like to get a full picture when I'm looking at like something that could be limiting athletic performance. And the way we want to think about this is you have a base, and the base, the bigger the base, the higher the peak, right? So if I have a very narrow base, the mountain can't get very big. But what if I have like a Mount Everest? Mount Everest's base is massive, which is what allows it to have a huge peak. Same for pyramids, right? So if we think of fitness and the fitness pyramid, we used to think like, okay, we have to have an aerobic base and then a strength base, and then we can begin to build on that and peak, right? So if you have very little strength, I can't make you run fast. Like people that run really, really fast have some power output. So when I look at this stuff, I'm looking at not just like your aerobic system, your strength, your lactate, your CP, blah, 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 and then peaking. I'm also looking at the adaptations, and we can't adapt if physiology isn't optimized. And this is why people get hurt. This is why people tweak stuff. It's not always why, like sometimes we actually do have catastrophic injuries, but ultimately when we're looking at physiology, we see the body, like eventually it just says no. And there's a really good book on that, actually. It's called When the Body Says No. And a part of that is also emotional. So we have to acknowledge that emotions play a part with our health. But when I look at blood work, I'm looking at like what could be some stuff that's preventing us from adapting and getting better. So right out the gate, when I was looking at your red blood cell stuff, honestly, man, your red blood cells were fantastic, right? Your hemoglobin, it was a little bit high. Kind of wanted for fitness and like optimal performance, it's a tight number, 14 to 15. Whereas if you go to like your regular old, lab, and we're just talking about people wanting to be couch potatoes, 13 to like 17, 13 and a half to 17 and a half is usually kind of acceptable, but couch potatoes are not high performers. They're not tactical athletes. They're not SF. They're not special operations. They're not CrossFitters, right? So there's a very different avatar of blood work we have to look at. And I'll talk about that a little bit more with glucose as well. But the first thing that goes through my head with hemoglobin being high is we're probably dealing with some dehydration. I'm willing to bet that there's some level of dehydration going on. Now, a lot of people will be like, well, I'm not dehydrated. I drink a ton of water. Drinking water and absorbing water are not the same, right? So we need to make sure that we recognize that water, once it's in the system and it's absorbed, it doesn't stay as like a liquid. It's more of like I guess the best way I would describe it is kind of like a gelatin. It's kind of like a jello. So we need to be able to absorb that water, which also means we need good physiological function and we need a lot of minerals in our system. So right out the gate, your hemoglobin was a little bit high for me. So I think you're a little dehydrated. And then the only other thing that really stood out to me was your MPV, and that was just a tiny, tiny bit high, right? So for that, we want like 7.5 to like 8, maybe 8.5. So you're just a little bit over that. Usually when I see that, I typically think, hey, probably dealing with a little bit of like pernicious anemia, and the patterns I'm seeing might indicate that. So I just want to throw you some B12 just to help a little bit with that. And I really do think that actually just by getting you some better B vitamins or more B vitamins, we should see an energy uptake. Your white blood cells. So this is where it gets pretty crazy. Well, at least in my mind, crazy or crazy fun. But white blood cells, they're actually pretty good. At 5 nowadays, I'm not too worried about it. But I'm also more concerned with how the body is prioritizing those white blood cells. Fine. So right out the gate, eosinophils tell me a lot about gut health. Basophils also tell me about that. So when your eosinophils and basophils are fine, I kind of just throw out the whole like dysbiosis thing. I'm like, if you had a parasite, you'd have eosinophils very high. But you don't. So I'm not worried about that. Now, when we see a lower neutrophil count and a higher lymphocyte count and a higher monocyte count, my first thought typically is, one, maybe some digestive stress because monocytes can go up with that, but also recent viral infection. I see this all the time. Like somebody gets the flu, somebody gets like a stomach virus, somebody gets whatever. And we do tend to see these numbers shift like that. So, in about a month and a half, 2 months when we redo these labs, we just want to make sure that we don't see the exact same thing. If we do, then we know something else is off. So, when lymphocytes are high, they can indicate a couple of things. My first thought is, hey, we're dealing with some form of like acute infection. But sometimes it also could be related to detoxification problems or what we might call systemic toxicity. And so when we get into your liver stuff, I'm going to talk a little bit about that because I think that might be playing a part. Now, when we start looking at your metabolism and stuff, so glucose, that was high. That was 96. Now, your typical lab, they're going to say things like, anywhere from like 70 to 99 is good. So the way that I like to think about this, and there's actually some really cool research that did some hazard ratio stuff on it. So what they did is they basically say, hey, we look at people's glucose and then we check back in on them in like 10 years. And we found that XYZ amount of people, when they were in this range of glucose, they were diabetic in 10 years or whatever, right? So we know that when we have these numbers, if nothing is done about it, then there's problems down the road. There's just no problem yet. We're young. We don't have to worry about it. It's kind of like smoking, right? Like if you smoke a pack a day and you're 20 and then you quit at 25, you're probably not going to have the same risk factor for cancer as if you are smoking a pack a day at 45 and you quit at 50, right? Just if we were to basically take everyone that has a blood glucose in the 90s and we were to say, hey, you're going to be diabetic in 10 years. We need to fix this now. It would probably collapse the entire healthcare system because it is designed, or the system is designed to kind of like reduce the systemic burden versus optimal health, right? At 99, you're telling me I'm fine, but at 100, I'm pre-diabetic, or at 119, I'm pre-diabetic, but at 120, I'm now diabetic. So once something breaks, changing an oil doesn't fix that. Like it's a catastrophic break. You have to do a catastrophic shift. And that's where all of a sudden people are getting, GLP-1 agonists, so peptides, right? Semaglutide, Wegovy, Ozempic. So when I look at your glucose, I'm like, dude, okay, we're on the trend to something not good. I need to fix this. Most Ricky tick. It is a pain in the ass because we're talking, hey, we're going to start taking extra fiber. We're going to start looking at chromium. We're going to start looking at berberine. We're going to start looking at liver support. And on that note, your kidneys were great. I'm not really worried about your kidneys. Your creatinine was a little bit high, but guess what? You lift weights. I kind of expect that. But your BUN was fantastic. Your BUN is your blood urea nitrogen. If that's high with a high creatinine, then I'm a little bit more concerned. But you're fine. You lift weights. You like to exercise. You train hard. You just finished up the Q course for special forces, right? Like Robin Sage ain't no joke. I expect creatinine to be a little bit high. If you were like 2, I'd be more concerned. But I kind of want it to be like 0.8 to 1.1. And if you're at 1.18, and you lift weights, not super worried about it. So I look at that and I'm like, whatever. Now, a couple other things. Sodium, I loved it. Sodium was great. Potassium, a little bit low for my taste. And when I see a low potassium, generally I kind of want it to be like 4 to 5. When I see a lower amount of potassium, my first thought is we're probably dealing with some stress. Now, if we were recently sick, that kind of makes sense because the initial phase of sickness is kind of like a fight or flight response. And then if it's a virus, especially, it kind of like dies off. So your sodium potassium ratio was over 35. It was like 35.6. So when I see that, it's like, okay, I want it to be more like a 31 to 34. Some say 30 to 35. Either way, it's over 35. So that to me says, hey, we're dealing with an inflammation or acute stressor. So if you were recently sick, which your labs kind of indicate that, I'm not freaking out, but we want to track that trend over time, and we want to keep our eyeballs on that, because if it's something that stays there, then we need to worry about that, because we want to make sure we have enough potassium, and we've got to figure out why that might not be working, because you can't just take a ton of potassium pills and fix that. That's tightly regulated by the body. Protein was great. Total protein being 6.9. I absolutely love it. Your albumin, 4.2. It's a wee bit low. I'd like to see like 4.5 to 5. Typically when I see it a wee bit low, my first thought is oxidative stress or inflammation, and also inflammation can cause oxidative stress. So there's probably a little bit of that. Vitamin C for sure can help a little bit with that, but also some liver dysfunction. And some of the things that go through my head right away would be, hey, do we get pain between the shoulder blades? Do we seem to be sensitive to certain chemicals, perfumes, like cleaning solvents, insecticides, exhaust? If you drink, are you a lightweight or are you not a lightweight? Do you get upset if you, not like emotionally upset, but like stomach upset if you eat greasy foods? Also, do you have hemorrhoids? That also can be related to liver stuff. And your magnesium was low. Everyone's is low. Like, no one is eating enough magnesium. I don't care who you are. If you eat enough magnesium, it means you're farting a ton, because you're basically eating a shit ton of beans, and no one does that. Calcium was great though. Phosphorus was fantastic, so I'm really happy with that. Your alk phos was high. Now I want that to be somewhere around like 45ish to 100. Yeah, my immediate thought is probably vitamin C deficiency, which would make sense, because bell peppers are fantastic for that. Love to eat bell peppers, but also getting a good vitamin C supplement. You live on a military installation. You're special forces. You're exposed to a ton of lead. You're on helicopters. You're inhaling this jet fuel, all this different stuff, right? So that's not something our livers were ever designed to handle. So ultimately, we're probably dealing with some liver congestion. ALT was also high at 59. So when I see a high ALT, my first thought is, okay, hey, this is straight up actually in the liver, and it could be like a fatty liver issue, which also increases blood sugar stuff. So that's where we're going to start supporting your liver big time. Glutathione and acetylcysteine, those two things are going to be mainstays. Also B vitamins, because they're fantastic and they're really good for you. And then we'll also take some stuff that's been shown to actually help with liver support. Now, the other stuff, your bilirubin 1.4, that's high. Bilirubin direct and indirect were both high. So essentially that's a gallbladder thing. Your GGT, that was a little bit high. It was a lot of it high, to be honest with you. But when it's high, what I immediately go to is, again, maybe you're drinking too much alcohol, but I don't think that's the case. So the next thought is we have something going on, liver and gallbladder. And so we need to start really looking into that and supporting the ever-living heck out of it. You have something called a Doritis ratio. That's basically your AST to ALT. And it's basically a math equation, right? And we want it to be 0 to 1. If it's over 1, not good. Usually indicates liver dysfunction, or also could indicate a lot of muscle damage, which I'm torn. If you had just done Robin Sage, I could say, hey man, you did Robin Sage 2 days ago. This makes sense. But I don't think that's the case. I really think we're dealing with more liver stuff, which is why I'm going to attack liver support and really help you out with that. And a couple other things I saw. Iron was high. Your ferritin was high. Ferritin being high. Ferritin is basically a storage form of iron, and when it's high, we're usually dealing with inflammation or liver dysfunction or oxidative stress. And it kind of makes sense, right? If you think about it, if you have a lot of inflammation and oxidative stress, well, oxidative stress will rust iron, so store it as ferritin. A little oversimplified, but hopefully that makes sense. But basically, it's another sign that, hey, we got something going on in the liver. But here's the really awesome thing, dude. Your cholesterol is fantastic. LDL, love it. HDL, absolutely fantastic. Cholesterol total, wonderful. Triglycerides, a little bit low. I'd like to see them a little higher, 70 to 80. You'll usually hear a lot of people out there say, oh no, low triglycerides are fantastic. We're only worried about high triglycerides. The thing with low triglycerides is, one, maybe you're a vegetarian or a vegan, so you don't get enough fat in your diet. Or sometimes we see this with hyperfunctioning thyroids. Graves' disease, that's actually kind of common, but you don't have Graves' disease. So the next thing is liver and biliary dysfunction. So again, more things just indicating, hey, we're probably dealing with some liver stuff. Other things we'll see to indicate that too, like if I see a low triglyceride with a high GGT and a high AST and ALT, I mean, if it looks like a duck, quacks like a duck, swims like a duck, it's not a fucking dog. It's a duck. So that's some stuff that we want to like make sure we keep our eyeball on. Now, thyroid, dude, your thyroid is fantastic. Metabolically speaking, love it, right? Like TSH is great. T4, T3, free T4, free T3, T3 uptake, free thyroxine index, which is T7. So that was also fantastic. Your free 3 to free T4 ratio was 2.75. That's a little bit high. But normally when it's high like that, I mean, the first thing that I think of is fatty liver. So again, support the liver. That's again, we're really trying to like get this liver stuff sorted out for you. CRP, that was a little bit high. We did HSCRP, so basically there's a difference. CRP generally is just C-reactive protein, but I did a high sensitivity C-reactive protein for you. That should be like conventionally no more than 1, but like optimal health, no more than 0.55. And so when we see that as high, I immediately think, hey, inflammation, or blood sugar dysregulation, like on the trend towards some like diabetes type stuff. Also, flossing. If you don't floss, brush your teeth twice a day and floss. I can't stress how important dental and oral health is. If you're not flossing, you need to start. And also if you're dipping, stop. Like you got to stop dipping. But that's immediately where my brain goes when it comes to the CRP stuff. Vitamin D, abysmally low, but hey, guess what? You're in the military and I don't care how often you're out in the sun. You're rocking long sleeves, pants, you're rocking a Kevlar, right? Like you're just not exposed to it very much. So we got to get you on some vitamin D. And that makes sense, right? Like everybody in the military is a little low. I'd like to see those numbers 70s. I know some people would say 80s. I just don't want to see it under 50. I mean, you're barely above the standard to prevent osteoporosis. So that's the lowdown on your labs. The protocol, I'm going to send that to you right now. And it's a little bit of a doozy, so you got to bear with me on it. There's a lot of stuff we got to fix. And I don't like to bullshit my guys. Like, I deeply care and make my men's success. I take it personally. So your success, I take that very personally. We're going to have to do some fixing here. And so that being said, I appreciate you coming to my TED Talk. If you have any questions, feel free to hit me up. And yeah, I'll talk to you soon. Cheers.